would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. Welcome to Monday, August 22nd, 2016. I hope you're all ready to kick off another great week. I hope you're using all the tools at your disposal to track those goals and push forward with them. I'm still a big fan of Google Calendars. I hate to keep saying it over and over again, but man, that thing sure does keep you on track in terms of telling it what goals you've got and having it constantly adapt when you have to push it out of the way to accommodate other things you have to do in your day. So if you're not using it, if you haven't given it a try, give it a go. If you're thinking to yourself, Robert, what are you thinking? Here's this other tool that's 10 times better than Google Calendars. Share that with me. I'm all about the calendars now that not only keep track of scheduled stuff, but now also track goals so that it'll dynamically change when it is if something conflicts with a goal time that you've set aside. For my money, Google Calendars is awesome, given its price, which is $0. So feel free to check that baby out if it's something that you haven't brought into your workflow yet. As always, the best way to get in contact with me is to head over to the website. You can go on over to www.therebelbroker.com, click on Contact the Rebel Broker, and at the contact page, you can go ahead and share any ideas, observations, suggestions, questions that you might have, and I would be oh so happy to answer them, or at least provide some input. If I don't know the answer, I'll try to at least point you in the right way, or do a little research myself and try to get the answer for you. I wanted to also jump in with, I don't know if I'd call it a correction, but maybe an update to a story from last week where we were talking about, in some cases, needing to update the wiring on really old wiring on homes in my area. Now, if you recall, we were discussing about the process where during the escrow, there comes a time, if you're getting financing, that you need to give proof of the setup of your insurance, right, for the homeowner's insurance. And in two cases in my career, I'll be honest, I've only, in all the years I've been doing this, and I've been doing this since the 80s, I've only sold a handful of homes that were old enough to have the old two-post porcelain style electrical wiring in them. Homes I have sold that are usually old enough to have those are usually from the 30s or earlier, and there's very few of those around. And when I have come across them, I think probably most of the time they've actually already had their wiring upgraded. So I know there were two instances in which we had homes that had that style of wiring, and I recall that in both of those cases, the wiring did get upgraded for the reasons of insurance. And I'm trying to think back. This was a long time ago. This was in the mid-90s. And I'm not 100% sure it was something that was required or if it was just something we negotiated to get done. But in any event, I walked away from those experiences pretty much convinced that in order for you to get your escrow closed, that's something to close. You need to be prepared for that. You need to be prepared for that eventuality. Well, I've had 3 different agents reach out to me. One of them, our good old buddy, Scott from Sacramento, who was telling me that up in his area where they have a lot more homes of that vintage, it's actually not that much of an issue. They actually can go through and get insurance for those without much of a problem. And then I had 2 more reach out to me from the East Coast to set the record straight that in those areas, it's not that big of a problem. It tends to be something you can work through. As long as there's no safety issues with it as it is installed, then everything is fine. So I think what this comes down to is probably a situation of region. If you live in an area where this is super common, just because you live in an area that has homes of that vintage and they're fairly common, I think probably that there are already, it's a normal part of their business, a normal part of their day-to-day. So, of course, allowances have been made. Here in Silicon Valley, that's ridiculously rare. I can't think of an area where we have homes of that vintage, except for some parts of downtown San Jose. And there is so much remodeling that goes on here that, and for the most part, if you do a remodel, if you have something like that kind of wiring that is no longer up to modern code, you're required to upgrade it. So I think that stuff just goes poof really fast in my area. So the norm for my market area is just that stuff's very just super rare. I actually called a couple of other agents just to see if one particularly that tends to really specialize in some of these neighborhoods with a lot older homes, and they were saying that in their entire career they've actually never encountered the dual post porcelain power in their transactions. So even for folks that do specialize in these homes with older vintages to them, they're not even seeing it. So the truth is, it's like with so many other things we talk about, it's going to depend on where you are. It's going to depend on how common that kind of wiring is in your area. So I wanted to, the first thing I always like to do is if I've communicated something that ended up being just to left of right or right of right, I like to make sure to communicate that so that you're prepared for it wherever you are. I'd hate for you to walk into something thinking, I need to understand this is going to cost me extra money, perhaps because you've done your own visual inspection, and get the happy surprise that it's not the case, but then you start thinking to yourself, well, what the heck was the Rebel Broker talking about? So just to set the record straight on that, I think it's going to be, your mileage may vary depending on where you are in the country and how common that kind of an electrical setup is. Okay, I've got a few things I wanted to talk about today. It's sort of a survey of the horizon, right? And in order to really try to get an idea of what's on the horizon, it's you need to look at where you are right at the moment. So I thought that sort of doing that. So there's a number of articles that I wanted to look into today. And one thing that's interesting is that negative equity is still hitting 1 in 10 homeowners, which is really kind of an interesting thing. If you just pay attention to the headlines, most people would be of the opinion that that is behind us, that there are no folks that are having this problem. The reality is that negative equity is something that's always been an issue. Even in the boom, there were some parts of the country where some folks had negative equity. Now, it wasn't anywhere near what we've seen during the downturn and in the years since, but that's always kind of a thing in some parts of the country. Now, according to this article from RIS Media, both urban and suburban communities have a significant share of homeowners in negative equity 5 years into the recovery. According to the second quarter Zillow negative equity report nationally, 13.7% of homeowners in urban regions and 11.2% of homeowners in suburban regions are currently underwater. After the housing bubble burst, nearly a third of homeowners in the United States were underwater on their mortgage. As the market recovered, many homeowners have gained back the lost value on their homes, freeing them to sell or refinance. In most areas of the country, negative equity is nearly equally spread across urban and suburban areas. In 13 of the nation's largest metros, the share of urban and suburban homeowners who are underwater is within 2 percentage points. Let's see. Now, the juiciest part of this particular story comes from giving an idea of where these areas are. Now, the western metros with strong job and housing markets have the lowest rates of negative equity. Less than 5% of mortgaged homeowners in San Jose, San Francisco, Portland, Denver, and Dallas are currently underwater. So it sounds like, given the data they're giving here, the further east, and I would guess the further south you go, that's where you're starting to see that number increase. And remember, the average here is 12.1%, down from 12.7% in the first quarter. So it's going to vary in different areas. You may actually see some areas of the country where that number is a little bit higher. Clearly, it's much lower here in the Silicon Valley area, in the San Jose, San Francisco area. But what's interesting is that they're indicating that it's there at all in terms of less than 5%. And what's also interesting is whenever I run these numbers locally here for the San Jose, San Francisco area, the folks who tend to still be underwater tend to be at the higher end. They tend to be the more luxury-oriented homes. Usually once we hit 2 million, that's where I start to see folks who are still not to the point where they're able to sell their homes for what they would have been able to at the peak before the downturn. So that's an interesting thing, I think, to keep in mind. Anybody whose homes fall into that sort of median average zone, plus, say, 10 to 20% over that, those folks have all recovered their values. I think the problem is that there's still a lot of hesitancy at those higher ends to sort of be willing to spend that kind of money, depending on where it's located. Obviously, the super high end is different in different areas. Now, when I say $2 million, I'm talking about $2 million homes in Morgan Hills, San Martin, parts of South San Jose. If we talk about that number in San Francisco, well, that $2 million is not super high end for San Francisco, to be honest, with the average price being $1.2 million. Creeping up to $2 million is not horribly unusual for something that would normally pass anywhere else for a very typical home. Next on the hit list today is housing market is definitely cooling down, according to the folks at RE/MAX. Home sales have decreased in June. Now, remember, we've talked about this before in terms of how deceiving that number can be. Yes, home sales have decreased, but there's still a demand, so we are still seeing home prices tending to stay up. Now, this data comes from July home sales. And according to this, July home sales cooled down, showing a decrease from June's highest year-to-date level, according to the National Housing Report from real estate listings agent RE/MAX, which analyzes 53 cities in the United States. In 49 of those markets, July home sales fell. The average decrease was 8.8% annually and 13.1% from June. In previous years, the average monthly drop was 8.2%. Let's see. Not only did total home sales drop, but also the median sales price across the country dropped, which dropped to $225,000 in June, but remains 4.7% higher than last year. So a month-to-month drop, but not a year-to-year drop. And remember, when we're talking about these numbers, the one you want to really focus on is the year-to-year number. It is natural as we head through the marketplace to start to see a little bit of a flattening of these prices. What is interesting, though, is that we do see that drop from month to month in June. Now, remember, the homes that we would be seeing reported in June would most likely be homes that went into escrow in May and then closed 30 days later or 30 to 45 days later in June. So it's not quite the end of the market, which indicates to me, as we talked about on this show earlier, that this season ended earlier than usual. And in some areas it's represented by data like this, and in some areas it's represented just by a slowdown. It's represented by still a very positive or pro-seller season, but more dominated by fewer buyers. So instead of, like we said before, instead of 12 offers, you're getting 5 offers, that type of a thing. So definitely a slowdown earlier than expected. Inventory, according to this report, continues to tighten and dropped 3% from last month and 16.6% from last year. So again, don't pay attention to that month-to-month number. That's not the number. And the most depressing part is that the worst number is the year-to-year number. When we have inventory dropping 16.6% from last year, that is not good. The current month's supply rests at 3.5 months. In other words, if no more homes were listed, it would take us 3.5 months to sell through all the current inventory. Now, 5 metro areas even reported inventory supply of less than 2 months. The average days on market decreased to 53 days, just 1 day less than June's average and 4 days less than last year. So despite the fact that we're seeing all of this tells you demand is still there. Even though the number of homes getting sold is down, that indicates that there is still very strong demand. Just 1 month after posting a nearly 4-year high, home sales in California took a step backwards in the month of July, with year-to-date sales falling from previous year for the first time in 18 months. That's an interesting number for me as someone who's actively looking to purchase in this marketplace, and I take a little bit more time to pay attention to the trends. I'm looking at how long homes are on the market. I stay in contact with homes that are listed to find out when they do receive offers. It was multiple offer situations, and it's very interesting. I actually feel kind of okay with my wait and see attitude that I've sort of taken here with Morgan Hill and Gilroy Properties, as things tend to slow down, and I'm starting to see more. I'm not seeing a slowdown in the number of homes listing at the current rate, which is still too low, but I'm not seeing as much competition. So I'm kind of hoping I'm going to have a good winter here in terms of being able to find really good investment properties or a property for myself right here in my home turf. Now, another element I wanted to talk about today was household debt, but we're going to talk about that in just a minute. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a minute. Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right, aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner, broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909. Welcome back, everyone. As promised, we're going to take a minute to talk about household debt. But as we do, I want you to try to remember some of the things we've talked about over the past few weeks in terms of just the dynamics. I'm not going to jump into the stuff we've already talked about. I'll sort of jump into that as we're going through this particular story. But keep that stuff in mind. And if you don't, as we go, I'll remind you. But the things that they say in this article's kind of interesting in terms of it's a warning that is trying to make you not worry. So we're going to talk about how some of the things they're talking about that are designed to make you not worry are maybe things we should be worrying a little bit about. According to this article, household debt is right back up to its 2008 peak, or it's very close to it. Other factors come together to show that it may not be as risky to households as it was before. And they're going to talk about that, and we're going to sort of think our way through whether or not we should be worried about it. I would argue that we should, simply because at this point, I'm just not sure how healthy much of any kind of debt is. Depending on how leveraged it is, right? Every piece of debt is different. If you are someone who owes $100,000 on a $200,000 house, well, you're probably okay. I don't see property values dropping 50%. I don't see you being underwater on that. Now, would you be underwater based on what your initial investment was? Yeah, maybe so. But at least you've got a buffer. You've got something you can rely on if necessary. Okay. According to this, some of the main differences today include improved credit conditions. Well, we can talk about that for a second. What's interesting is how contradictory this is to other things that we read, right? The things that we read are that, well, credit conditions aren't that good. People talk about how difficult it is to get loans and how people who should be qualified to get loans aren't getting them. Now, I've argued that I haven't really seen that. The reality of on the ground for me is I have yet to encounter a buyer who has not been able to qualify for a loan. The limiting factor hasn't been whether or not they can qualify for a loan. The limiting factor has been whether or not they can find a house to buy. So I think that's an interesting one. But let's talk about credit conditions for a second. Let's talk about 3% loans, 2% loans, 1% loans, and 0% loans, all things that we have talked about here on this show as potential vehicles to put us right back in a negative situation like we were before the last downturn. Because remember, all of those style of loans assume that the properties these folks are using as collateral are not going to drop in value more than what they owe, right? Now, if you've got a 0% loan, and we've talked about a number of banks that are doing 0% loans, but let's pretend for a second that that's just too regional. Let's not go there for now, because there are various areas where you can't get that 0% loan. Let's talk about the 3% loan. Now, you'll argue, well, that's been an FHA thing for a long time. Well, yeah, but now it's not just being offered by FHA. It's being offered by mainstream banks, continuing to be backed by the government. So, in other words, these banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase, are all continuing to write these 3% loans, but then turning around and selling them to Fannie. So you still end up being on the hook for the potential downside of any decrease in performance on the loan, meaning if someone stops making payments on it for some reason, taxpayers are on the hook again. That should be something that's worrisome. All right. So we've got these 3% loans, which basically implies that if property values go down 3.1%, well, these folks are suddenly underwater, right? And so then we have to just sort of figure out, well, what's the sweet spot? At what point will buyers start to think, I'm better off just pulling up tent stakes and leaving, abandoning this loan and getting out? the point at which that started to happen last time wasn't so far in. It was usually once once property values had dropped about 10%, we started to actually see that. We started to actually see people abandon their loans. And of course, I think the number is a psychological thing, right? If someone comes to you and says you're $10,000 in the hole on a house versus telling you you're $100,000, well, that has a different impact on you mentally, and both of those numbers may only mean 5% of the purchase price, right? Depending on where you are. So I think that's actually a number that we need to pay attention to. But remember, these are all the same. And what really concerns me is we're emulating a lot of the lending practices that were going on before. And then you're going to come back and you're going to say, well, listen, Robert, according to what I've read about these 3%, 2%, 1%, 0% loans, they are more stringent on their credit rating requirement. And you'd be absolutely correct in saying that. They are more stringent according to what we've been told. But remember what else we've learned is that the credit requirements have been reduced. Your credit rating can now be based on things that your credit rating was never based on before, like paying your power bill and your water bill, that kind of stuff, which isn't your phone bill, right? None of those things are indicators of your credit worthiness. I'm not sure who has decided that they are, but they just aren't. If you don't pay your power bill, your power gets turned off. If you don't pay your water bill, your water gets turned off. These are all, and even when folks stopped paying their mortgages, we found these folks continued to pay their cable bill. They continued to pay their water bill. Why? Because in the range of things folks consider that they must have, those apparently are there. But for whatever reason, those folks didn't continue to pay their mortgage payments. Isn't that kind of interesting? Because they need water and they need some level of entertainment, I guess, and the cheapest entertainment they can get is that cable connection. So I don't think we're measuring that stuff accurately. I think we have sort of come at it from a two-faced approach. We've come at it from hey, we're going to offer all these really aggressive loan packages that put taxpayers on the hook for any defaults, but we're going to have really good credit requirements for it. And then with the same hand, the opposite hand from the same organization, they say, now we're going to change how we measure people's credit. I would argue that we are now actually in a worse position than we were because we've convinced ourselves that we've built in these safeguards. So everyone seems to be charging headlong into these kinds of things without realizing the stage that's been set for us. Okay. Banks tighten their standards on some consumer loans, according to a recent report from Capital Economics. And I think we've covered that, right? These tightening of standards on consumer loans has been, in my opinion, overcompensated by a relaxing on the criteria that these loans are evaluated on, specifically the credit rating. In fact, for some of these loans, it was mentioned that if folks had a bad credit rating, they'd use alternative means to evaluate their credit. Do you all recall that? It's when we were talking about the 0 and 3% loans specifically. It was specifically mentioned that there'd be alternative methods of calculating your credit. Now, I think probably one of the most interesting statements made in this particular article is this one. Quote, however, the gains in income over the past 8 years and the decline in interest rates mean that households are now in a far stronger position to pay down that debt that they were prior to the financial crisis. And this is according to Capital Economics chief economist Paul Ashworth. Well, here's what's interesting about that statement is he would have made the exact same statement just before the downturn last time. Right? If he were to go in a time machine and go 6 months before the downturn, couldn't you have said the exact same thing? Maybe not about interest rates. Interest rates were still pretty awesome. They were still single digit. They were in the 4 or 5% range. I think 6 was the worst. I know when I bought my property just before the downturn, well, not just before, a couple of years before, it was 5-point-something%. So even from a historical standpoint, you could make that statement that interest rates had remarkably declined and that households are in a far stronger position to pay down that debt than they were prior to the financial crisis. Well, yes, everybody was in a much better position prior to the financial crisis. That's why we call it a financial crisis. Anybody else find that interesting? It's like saying that the Titanic was exceptionally shipworthy just before it hit the iceberg. Yeah, that's right. It was. But then it hit an iceberg, and it wasn't. Same thing with our current market. And I'll tell you what's creepy now is so many of the things that we're seeing absolutely mimic the stupid stuff that we were doing leading up to the real estate focused downturn that we've already gone through. But it wasn't on this stage that's now been set by all this other stuff that's outside of real estate. And it's one reason why I bring up all these other things like derivatives and all that kind of stuff, because these are all things that absolutely play into this. And if any one of those things goes wrong, it will just wash over everything in your life. I mean, real estate will be part of it. Your job situation will be part of it. It will be unpleasant in the extreme. And of course, if that happens, depending on what kicks it off, you will all be in a great position before the downturn that may be coming than you will be after. That's the nature of a downturn. So I'm not real sure why Mr. Ashworth, I don't know if maybe I'm not getting it in context here, but the context in which it's being used to try to convince the reader of a certain point is true, but pointless. If there is a downturn, he seems to indicate that scenario seems to indicate we won't have a downturn. I would argue that we're resetting the stage real estate-wise for there to be a downturn. And maybe right now, the big question to ask isn't, will there be a downturn? There will, right? The one thing you can count on is that given enough time, there will be a downturn. Maybe the big question to ask isn't if there will be a downturn, but what will cause it? Because we've got so many different things on the menu that could potentially cause it. We're setting the stage now to do another real estate downturn, independent of all this other stuff, independent of derivatives and all these other things. We are in a position right now where we're setting that stage. And we're setting that stage to the same level it was set in terms of criteria as just a few months before the downturn, or maybe a year or two before the downturn. Or no, I guess, maybe even going back years. So maybe going back more like to 2007. Or maybe even earlier, maybe 2000, right? Because remember, this all started in 1995 and things got progressively crazier. And we didn't start seeing those 110% loans until 2003? So maybe we need to go back to say we're setting a stage for something around 2000, because I'm not seeing any 110% loans yet. I read in one article that was supposedly a thing, but I never heard about it from anyone else. And I've talked to lenders and they're saying, nope, no one's doing 110% loans anywhere. So I'm going to assume that was some sort of lunatic fringe, tinfoil hat kind of a thing. But right now, we've absolutely set the stage. So the only thing we're missing is volume. Now, whether you want to call it lucky or unlucky, we have an artificially suppressed amount of volume of sales simply because of the low inventory in a lot of areas. But because of the way this stage has been set, it just simply means we need to prime this disaster pump with people who have bought under these circumstances, right? These are all things that have happened within the last year. So everyone who's buying, and I'd love to know what percentage of the population is buying under these circumstances, the folks who are buying homes with the 0%, 1%, 2%, 3% loans, I want to know how many of those are happening. I want to know how many loans of those types are being funded every quarter. Because that's the pump that's being primed. Those are the loans that we should be most concerned about. And as soon as we get enough volume of those, and remember, what screwed us last time was we had a huge volume of those. But it took us a decade to rack those suckers up. And then the ones that were racked up over the last 5 years before the downturn were even worse, right? Because they were of the 110% variety. They were of the completely free-for-all variety. So the stuff that was really ludicrous and crazy represented a huge percentage of the number of homes that were loaned. The number of mortgages that were funded. But we're not there yet. I just, in my head, I'm thinking, and I don't have a lot of data for this, but just given the amount of time we're talking about here, these loans haven't been available long enough for me to think that they represent a substantial portion of the number of loans that have actually been funded. So I think the higher probability of a near-term problem comes more from, or things we should be more worried about over the next year or two, have far more to do with things external to real estate-specific things than to real estate-specific things. Unless we start to see a huge volume of purchasing that fits this criteria. All right, so I thought I'd share that with you. Just given how much is going on and how numbers are kind of interestingly shifting. And it's also interesting to note, this is an article that I read a couple of weeks ago that I didn't include in the show because it was one of those ones I had sort of on the side and the topic we were talking about took too long. But we've had an increase in household income of 0.0 something percent. It was something like 0.07%, but household spending had gone up 0.09%. So, and I seem to recall mentioning it, but that's a thing too. That gives you a feeling for what's going on with people out there in the world that you're going to be dealing with. Whether you're an investor and you're dealing with potential tenants, or you're an investor who's flipping and you're dealing with potential buyers. Those are the kinds of things that are going on, and those are things that can inform you as to, well, what can we expect moving forward? That indicates a little bit of a higher level of confidence, right? A willingness to go out and spend more money than you've just gotten an increase on. But it also indicates the kind of an attitude that might be concerning if we're worried about folks being more aware of what they're spending and more aware of how much debt they're taking on. So we're definitely in a transitionary period. It's hard to tell how these things are going to shake out, but if we have any huge bumps on the road, I think there's a lot of potential downsides. All right, folks. Thanks again for making the show a regular part of your daily routine. I am forever in your debt for your support. Please do head on over to www.therebelbroker.com where you can check out the show notes for today's show. But you can also click on the support the show by taking this survey button, which will allow me to get more demographic information about the folks who listen to the show. It's like 5 to 7 questions, very easy to do, and you'd be doing the show a big favor. Thanks again for listening, everyone. I'll talk to y'all next time.